Every kid who grew up in the 1950s, the 1960s, or the 1970s did things that would make a modern parent lose sleep for a week. You rode in cars with nothing holding you in place. You left the house after breakfast and nobody knew where you were until dinner. You climbed trees with no one watching, played on equipment hot enough to blister skin, and nobody so much as raised an eyebrow. It was just called being a kid. But today, half of what counted as a perfectly normal Saturday would trigger a phone call to Child Protective Services. Number 47 on this list was sitting in the middle of nearly every neighborhood in America, completely unfenced, with no lock and no adult watching. And the substance behind number 17 is now classified as hazardous waste, but your parents handed it to you with their bare hands and told you to have fun with it. So hit subscribe and settle in, because here are 100 things about growing up that would absolutely horrify parents today. Number 100, climbing the tallest tree in the neighborhood with nobody watching. In every neighborhood in the 1960s and 1970s, there was one tree that every kid wanted to conquer. It was the oak or the elm at the end of the block, the one with branches thick enough to grab but spaced far enough apart that reaching the next one meant stretching until your sneakers dangled in the air. You climbed it alone. You climbed it in groups. You climbed it until you were so high that the rooftops looked small and your stomach told you it was time to stop. There were no harnesses, no helmets, no crash pads below. If a branch snapped, you fell, and the only safety net was the dirt. A broken arm from a tree fall was treated the same as a scraped knee from the sidewalk. It happened, you healed, and you climbed again the next week. Today, some cities have ordinances against children climbing trees in public parks. Back then, a kid who had never climbed a tree was the one people worried about. Number 99. Building bicycle ramps out of plywood and cinder blocks in the middle of the street. Every summer, someone dragged a sheet of plywood out of a garage and propped it up on a stack of cinder blocks or a pile of bricks. The ramp sat right in the street, sometimes at the bottom of a hill, and every kid on the block took a running start and launched off of it. There was no calculation of angle or landing distance. You pedaled as fast as you could and hoped for the best. Landings happened on bare pavement. Crashes happened on bare pavement. The ramp stayed in the road until a car came through, and then you dragged it to the curb for 30 seconds and put it right back. Nobody wore pads, nobody wore a helmet, and nobody called it reckless. It was a Tuesday. Number 98. Staying out all day with absolutely no way to call home. There were no cell phones, there were no pagers for children. You left the house in the morning, and your parents had no way to reach you, and you had no way to reach them. If something went wrong, you either found a neighbor willing to let you use the phone, or you handled it yourself. Entire afternoons passed without a single adult knowing whether you were at the creek, in the woods, at a friend's house 3 blocks away, or somewhere you were definitely not supposed to be. Your mother might lean out the back door around dinner and shout your name into the neighborhood, and if you were close enough to hear it, you came running. Yeah, if you were not, she waited. Today, a child without a phone and a GPS tracker is considered practically abandoned. Back then, it was every single day of summer. Number 97. Eating raw cookie dough straight from the bowl. When your mother or your grandmother mixed up a batch of chocolate chip cookies, the raw dough was half the reason you were standing in the kitchen in the first place. You ate it by the spoonful. You scraped the beaters clean. You licked the inside of the bowl until your finger squeaked on ceramic. Nobody mentioned salmonella. Nobody brought up the risk of raw eggs or unprocessed flour. It was just one of the small rewards of baking day. Today, the Centers for Disease Control issues formal warnings about the dangers of consuming unbaked dough, and commercially produced cookie dough is reformulated with heat-treated flour and pasteurized eggs specifically so it can be eaten raw without as much risk. In the 1960s and 1970s, the closest thing to a safety warning was your mother telling you to save room for the actual cookies. Number 96. Playing in the street as your main recreation. The street in front of your house was not just a road. It was the baseball diamond, the football field, the racetrack, and the gathering place for every kid within 3 blocks. You played stickball and kickball in the middle of the pavement, scattering to the curb when a car came through, then regrouping the second it passed. Nobody set up cones or blocked off traffic. You just played and kept one ear open for engines. In neighborhoods across America, the street was the largest flat open space available, and it belonged to whoever was out there using it. A passing car was a temporary interruption, not a reason to go inside. Today, children playing unsupervised in a residential street are likely to generate a concerned phone call from a neighbor or a visit from a patrol officer. Back then, it was simply where the games happened. Number 95. Running through the sprinklers on somebody else's lawn without asking. On a hot day, if a neighbor's sprinkler was running, it was considered open territory. You ran through it. Your friends ran through it. The neighbor either waved from the porch or did not notice, and either way, nobody filed a complaint. There was no concern about trespassing, liability, property boundaries, or whether the water had been treated with lawn chemicals an hour earlier. It was a sprinkler. It was hot. You ran through it. The entire concept of a child needing permission to cool off in a neighbor's yard spray would have sounded ridiculous to anyone alive in 1965. Today, a homeowner might worry about a lawsuit if a child slips on wet grass, and a parent might worry about chemical exposure from a recent lawn treatment. Back then, the only concern was whether you tracked mud into the house afterward. Number 94. Walking to school alone starting in the 1st grade. Plenty of 6-year-olds in the 1950s and 1960s walked to school without an adult beside them, sometimes for a mile or more, crossing busy intersections, cutting through alleys, and navigating the neighborhood entirely on their own judgment. An older sibling might walk with you for the first few days. After that, you were on your own. No parent drove behind you. No crossing guard waited at every corner. You learned the route, you avoided the dogs that barked too close to the fence, and you showed up at school on time, or you faced the consequences. Today, parents in some communities have been investigated by authorities for allowing children under 10 to walk to school unaccompanied. In mid-century America, it was simply the morning routine. The school bus was for the kids who lived out in the country. Everyone else walked. Number 93. Sprawling across the back of the station wagon on a road trip. The family station wagon was not just a vehicle, it was a rolling living room. On long drives, children climbed into the rear cargo area, spread out blankets, stacked up pillows, and rode for hours lying flat with no seatbelt, no car seat, and no restraint of any kind. Some families folded the back seats down entirely to create a play space where kids could roll around, read comic books, nap, or fight over legroom while the car barreled down the interstate at highway speed. A sudden stop would have sent every one of them sailing forward with nothing to slow them down. Nobody talked about it. It was simply how families traveled before laws changed everything. Today, every child in every vehicle is required by law to be secured in an age-appropriate restraint system. Back then, the cargo area of the station wagon was the best seat in the house. Number 92. The metal playground slide in August. Every public park and schoolyard in America had one. A tall, steep, entirely metal slide with no shade above it, baking in the summer sun until the surface reached temperatures hot enough to raise welts on the back of your thighs. You climbed the ladder, sat down, felt the searing heat, and yelped all the way to the bottom. Some kids tried wetting the surface with a splash of water first. Others just endured it and moved fast. The metal held the heat of the entire afternoon, and by 2 in the afternoon on a July day, touching it with your bare hand was enough to make you flinch, but you still went down it every single time. Today, playground slides are made from molded plastic designed to resist heat buildup. In the 1960s and 1970s, they were sheet metal bolted to a steel frame, and they were exactly as hot as you remember. Number 91. Baby oil as your only sun protection. Sunscreen existed in the 1960s and 1970s, But a large portion of American families were not buying it. What many people used instead was baby oil, slathered across the shoulders and the chest and the bridge of the nose, specifically to deepen the tan and speed it along. The oil had no sun protection factor at all. It worked like a basting liquid, essentially frying the skin under ultraviolet light while making it glisten. A bad sunburn was treated with a cold washcloth or a bottle of Noxzema, and by the following weekend you were back outside with a fresh coat of oil and a peeling forehead. The connection between sun exposure and skin cancer was not widely understood by the general public until well into the 1980s. For an entire generation, spending the summer turning dark brown was considered a sign of good health, and baby oil was the tool that got you there. Number 90. Climbing every tree in the neighborhood as high as the branches would hold you. If a tree had a low branch, a kid was going to climb it. There was no assessment of structural integrity, no discussion about how high was too high, and no safety lecture from an adult standing below. You grabbed the lowest limb, pulled yourself up, and kept going until you either ran out of branches or got scared enough to stop. Some kids climbed 30 or 40 feet into a cottonwood and sat there looking out over rooftops and telephone wires. A dead branch could snap without warning. Wet bark could send you sliding. A fall from that height onto packed dirt or roots could break an arm or crack a rib. Parents generally did not know how high their children were climbing, and most of the ones who did had done the exact same thing when they were young. Today, organized tree climbing programs exist with harnesses and certified instructors. Back then, you just climbed. Number 89. Going to the corner store at 7 years old with a dollar bill in your pocket. Your mother needed a quart of milk or a loaf of bread, and she sent you to get it. You were 7, maybe 8, walking several blocks through the neighborhood with a crumpled bill in your front pocket, crossing streets, passing strangers, making the purchase by yourself at the counter, and walking home carrying the bag. Nobody considered this unusual. The store owner knew your name and your family, and if you came up short on change, he might let it slide until your mother came by next. It was an errand, not an expedition, and it happened in every neighborhood in every town. Today, a 7-year-old walking alone to a convenience store would probably prompt a concerned bystander to stop them or call someone. In mid-century America, it was just how families handled a missing ingredient when the nearest store was a few blocks on foot. Number 88. The playground merry-go-round. This was not the gentle, friction-braked spinning disc found in a handful of modern playgrounds today. This was a flat metal platform, roughly 8 feet across, mounted on a central post with heavy-duty bearings that allowed it to spin with almost no resistance, and children made it spin as fast as humanly possible. The ritual was always the same. Everyone climbed on and grabbed a metal bar. 1 or 2 kids stayed on the ground and pushed, running alongside the platform, gripping the rails, and hurling their full weight into each rotation until the whole thing was moving so fast that the riders could barely hold on. Then the pushers leaped aboard, and everyone clung to the bars while centrifugal force tried to rip them loose. Kids flew off regularly. They hit the dirt at speed, tumbled across gravel, skinned their elbows and knees raw, and sometimes broke a wrist or a forearm trying to catch themselves on the way down. The platform itself was heavy enough to do real damage to anyone who got caught beneath it or tried to slow it down by dragging a foot on the ground. One bad move and the steel edge could clip a shin bone or roll over a set of fingers. Some merry-go-rounds were so well oiled that they kept spinning for a full minute after the last push, which meant a kid who fell off still had to dodge the platform as it came around again and again. By the late 1980s and into the 1990s, most of these were pulled out of public parks across the country and replaced with equipment designed to meet new federal safety guidelines. But for decades, the merry-go-round was the centerpiece of every playground, and the unspoken rule was simple: hold on tight or eat dirt. Nobody wore a helmet. Nobody signed a permission slip. You just held on and hoped the kid pushing knew when to stop. Number 87. Dodgeball with the hard red rubber ball. The version of dodgeball played in American schools through the 1960s and 1970s used a ball that could leave a mark on your skin for an hour. It was not foam, it was thick, stiff rubber, about the size of a soccer ball, and when it connected with your face at close range, the sting brought tears whether you wanted them or not. And gym teachers divided the class, lined everybody up, and let them throw. The strongest arm in the room became a temporary force of nature. If you were small or slow, you spent most of the game plastered against the cinder block wall, trying not to get picked off. There were no rules about aiming below the waist in most schools. You threw where you threw, and you dodged or you took the hit. Today, many school districts have removed traditional dodgeball from the curriculum, citing concerns about targeting, aggression, and the potential for real injury. In the 1970s, it was just gym class on a Tuesday. Number 86. Jumping off the high dive without hesitation. The public pool in most American towns had a high diving board, usually 10 feet above the water, sometimes 12. There was no prerequisite. There was no swim test. If you could climb the ladder, you could jump. Kids as young as 5 or 6 stood at the end of that board, stared down at the water below, and jumped. Some belly flopped. Some hit the water at angles that knocked the wind out of them. Some panicked on the way down and flailed their arms the whole way. The lifeguard watched to make sure you came back up, but stopping you from climbing in the first place was not part of the job. Today, high diving boards have been pulled from the vast majority of public pools across the country because of liability costs and insurance requirements. In the 1960s and 1970s, the high dive was a rite of passage. You climbed up terrified, you jumped, and then you climbed right back up to do it again. Moment for the combat. The seesaw with no cushion and no spring. The playground seesaw of the 1950s and 1960s was a plank of wood or a steel beam balanced on a metal fulcrum, and its only safety feature was your grip. When the kid on the other end jumped off without warning, your side dropped like a stone and your tailbone slammed into the hard-packed ground beneath you with the full weight of gravity and the plank behind it. It happened all the time. It happened on purpose. Getting the other kid to crash was, for many children, the entire point of the game. Some seesaws had metal handles that caught you under the chin on impact. Some had splintered wooden seats that left a mark through your jeans. The drop from full height was enough to jar your teeth loose. Today, the few seesaws that remain in public parks use springs at the base to cushion the landing, or they have been replaced altogether. In the 1960s, the jolt at the bottom was just part of the ride. Number 84. Swinging as high as you could and jumping off at the peak. Every child who spent any time on a swing set eventually tried the launch. You pumped your legs until the swing was nearly horizontal. The chains went slack for a split second at the very top of the arc, and then you released your grip and flew. For one brief moment, you were airborne, several feet above the ground, traveling forward with no control over where or how you would land. Some kids stuck it clean. Others hit the dirt face first or crumpled sideways onto a hip. Broken wrists and sprained ankles were common enough that everyone knew someone who had done it. The ground beneath most swing sets was packed earth, gravel, or bare dirt, offering nothing in the way of cushion. Nobody stopped you. Nobody told you it was dangerous. It was simply the advanced move, the one you graduated to once you had mastered the basic swing. Today, playground surfaces are required to be impact absorbing. Back then, the ground was just the ground. Number 83. Lawn darts. They were called jarts, and they were exactly what they sounded like. Large, heavy, metal-tipped darts designed to be tossed underhand across the yard so they would arc through the air and stick point first into the grass near a plastic ring. They weighed close to a pound each, and the tips were sharp enough to puncture soil on impact. Kids threw them in backyards, at cookouts, at family picnics, and the rules were loose enough that half the time you were standing in the landing zone while someone on the other end let one fly. Emergency rooms across the country treated puncture wounds, and in 1988 the Consumer Product Safety Commission banned them after years of injuries and at least 3 documented child fatalities. Before that, they sat in garage corners and tool sheds like any other piece of outdoor equipment, right next to the croquet set and the badminton rackets. Number 82. Playing King of the Hill on a dirt mound. The rules were as old as childhood itself. One kid stood at the top of the highest pile of dirt, gravel, or snow in the area, and everybody else tried to pull that kid down and claim the spot. Shoving, grabbing, tackling, and dragging by the ankles were all standard moves. The king fought off attackers from every direction while standing on loose, shifting ground that gave way with every step. Kids rolled down embankments, landed on rocks, crashed into each other full force, and got right back up covered in mud to try again. In winter, the mound was usually a pile of plowed snow packed hard into ice, and every tackle became a full-body slide across a frozen surface. Bloody noses were routine. Torn jackets were expected. No adult refereed or set boundaries. The only rule was the one that mattered: be the last one standing. Number 81. Red Rover at every recess. 2 lines of children stood facing each other across the playground, arms linked tightly at the elbows, forming a solid human chain. One side called out a name, and the chosen child had to sprint at the opposing line and try to smash through. The impact of a running child hitting a wall of locked arms was exactly as violent as it sounds. Broken forearms happened more than anyone admitted. Dislocated shoulders were a real possibility. A child who failed to break through could be clotheslined across the chest or caught hard across the throat. The ones who did break through often hit the ground behind the line and skidded across gravel. Teachers watched from the side. Sometimes they joined in. By the early 2000s, many school districts had pulled Red Rover from the approved list of recess activities because of the injury reports. In the 1960s and 1970s, it was simply how you spent your 20 minutes of freedom between classes. Number 80. Crack the whip on the playground. A line of kids linked hands. The leader at one end started running in a wide curve, and the physics of angular momentum handled the rest. Each child in the chain moved a little faster than the one ahead of them, and by the time the force reached the last kid in line, that child was traveling at a speed that no legs could keep up with. When the grip finally broke, the tail end of the whip went flying, usually across blacktop or packed gravel. The longer the chain, the more violent the release. Skinned palms and bruised knees were the minimum cost of playing. A concussion was always one stumble away. Nobody wore protective equipment. Nobody drew up rules. Nobody checked on the kid who hit the fence. You just grabbed a hand, held on tight, and prayed you were somewhere near the front of the line, not the end of it. Number 79. Firecrackers on the 4th of July. In neighborhoods across America through the 1960s and 1970s, the 4th meant one thing for children: unsupervised access to small explosives. Fathers bought bricks of firecrackers at roadside stands or from the trunk of someone's car, and kids lit them one at a time, threw them into the air, dropped them into tin cans, packed them into dirt mounds, and held them between their fingers until the very last second before the fuse hit the powder. Some states allowed consumer fireworks, others banned them. The distinction made almost no practical difference. Someone in every neighborhood always had firecrackers, and they were distributed to children with no instruction beyond a vague reminder to be careful. Burned fingertips were expected. Singed eyebrows were a badge of honor. The smell of sulfur and black powder hung over every block from morning until well past midnight. Today, most consumer fireworks face heavy restrictions in residential areas. Back then, a 10-year-old with a box of matches and a string of black cats was just celebrating the holiday. Number 78. Running through the yard with a lit sparkler in each hand. The sparkler was the one firework that every parent in America considered safe enough for a small child, and it was far more dangerous than it looked. A burning sparkler reaches temperatures well above 1,000 degrees at the tip. Children gripped them, waved them in circles to write their names in the dark, and sprinted across the lawn while the hot sparks rained down on bare feet and cotton clothes. The thin wire stayed scorching hot long after the sparkler burned out, and stepping on a spent one with bare feet left a welt that lasted for days. Every 4th of July, emergency rooms across the country treated children with burns from sparklers on their hands, their legs, and near their eyes. Today, sparklers remain among the leading causes of fireworks injuries in young children. In the 1960s and 1970s, handing a lit one to a toddler at a backyard cookout was just part of the evening. Number 77. The backyard swing set that rocked right out of the ground. Most swing sets sold for home use in the 1960s and 1970s were held in place by nothing more than 2 hollow metal legs pressed a few inches into the lawn. There was no concrete footing. There were no ground anchors or tie-downs. When a child pumped hard enough, the entire frame lifted on one side, hung in the air for a stomach-dropping second, and then crashed back down with a clang. The harder you swung, the more violently the whole structure lurched and bucked beneath you. Known. Some swing sets slowly walked across the yard over the course of a summer, leaving a trail of shallow craters behind them. Others tipped over completely, sending the swing and the child attached to it tumbling into the grass and bringing several dozen pounds of steel tubing down on top of them. Parents saw it happening and mostly told you to take it easy. Nobody drilled anchors into the lawn. The set stayed where it was, held up by nothing but gravity and good intentions. Number 76. Playing out of sight of any adult for entire hours at a time with no one knowing exactly where you were. This was not a lapse in parenting. This was the standard operating procedure of childhood in America. You told your mother you were going outside, and that was the last meaningful communication until the sun went down. You could be in the neighbor's backyard, in the drainage ditch 2 streets over, on top of the roof of the corner garage, or knee-deep in a creek a half-mile from home, and no adult anywhere had the slightest idea. There was no GPS, there was no tracking app, there was no check-in call. The only expectation was that you would appear in one piece before the porch light flickered on. If you came home late, you got an earful. If you came home bleeding, someone handed you a bandage. The entire framework of structured playdates, supervised outings, and constant digital monitoring that defines modern childhood would have baffled any parent standing on their front steps in 1967. Kids went outside and eventually came back. That was the whole system. Number 75. Monkey bars over nothing but concrete. The monkey bars at most schools and public parks in the 1960s and 1970s stood 6 or 7 feet off the ground, sometimes higher, and below them was a flat slab of asphalt or a thin layer of packed dirt that may as well have been asphalt. You hung by your hands, swung from rung to rung, and if your grip slipped or your arms gave out, you fell straight down onto a surface with zero give. Broken wrists and fractured forearms were among the most common playground injuries of the era. Some kids hung upside down from their knees, adding the risk of a headfirst drop onto hard ground to an already dangerous piece of equipment. No one installed rubber matting. No one set a height limit. The monkey bars were simply there, and the ground beneath them was whatever the ground happened to be. Number 74. Playing tackle football in the yard with no pads and no rules. On any given autumn afternoon, a group of neighborhood kids gathered on the nearest patch of grass and played football the way it had always been played, which was full contact with nothing but a t-shirt between your ribs and the ground. There were no helmets, there were no mouth guards, there were no weight classes or age divisions. A 12-year-old could tackle a 9-year-old at full speed into a dirt patch, and nobody on either side complained. The field was usually uneven, dotted with tree roots, rocks, and the occasional sprinkler head buried just below the surface. Broken collarbones, jammed fingers, and bloody lips were considered part of the game. Adults did not organize it, did not coach it, and did not intervene unless someone was clearly unconscious. You played until it got dark or until someone had to go home for dinner. Number 73. Snowball fights where the snowballs had ice packed inside. A clean snowball fight was one thing. What actually happened in most neighborhoods was something rougher. Kids packed snow around a core of ice, or they let a snowball freeze overnight and brought it out the next morning as a solid projectile. A direct hit to the face with a half-frozen snowball could split a lip or blacken an eye. Some kids buried rocks inside. Others simply threw whatever chunk of hard snow they could pry off the top of a drift. The fights were unsupervised. The rules were non-existent, and the arms race escalated until someone went home crying or bleeding. No adult mediated. No one inspected the ammunition. Winter was just rougher back then, and the bruises faded before anyone thought to ask where they came from. Number 72. The rope swing over the creek. Somewhere behind every neighborhood, or at the edge of every small town, there was a creek with a rope hanging from a high branch over the water. Nobody knew who put it there. It had been there forever. The rope was frayed, sun-bleached, and tied to a branch that may or may not have been strong enough to hold the weight of a growing teenager. But every kid in the area used it. You grabbed the rope as high as you could reach, backed up the bank for a running start, and launched yourself out over the water. At the peak of the arc, you let go and dropped. If the water was deep enough, you splashed in clean. If it was shallow, or if the current had shifted the bottom, since the last time anyone checked, you hit mud or rocks or a submerged log that nobody could see from the bank. There was no way to know what was under the surface until you were already falling. Some kids swung out and realized too late that the rope was not going to carry them far enough, and they dropped into the shallow edge where the water barely covered the stones. Others held on too long on the backswing and slammed into the bank. The branch creaked. The knot slipped a little lower every summer. Occasionally the whole thing came down and someone had to tie a new rope higher up, which meant climbing a tree that hung out over the water at a dangerous angle. There were no lifeguards. There were no adults. There was just a rope, a creek, and whatever nerve you brought with you. A broken arm or a gash from a submerged rock was treated at home with ice and a bandage, and you were back on the rope the following weekend. Number dop. Today, a rope swing over an unmonitored waterway would be cut down by the Parks Department within a week. Back then, it was just the best spot in the neighborhood. Number 71. Getting your first pocket knife at age 8. For a generation of American boys, and more than a few girls, receiving your first pocket knife was a milestone on the same level as learning to ride a bike. Your father or your grandfather handed you a folding knife, showed you how to open and close it without cutting yourself, maybe demonstrated how to whittle a stick, and that was the extent of the safety training. From that point forward, you carried a knife in your pocket to school, to the woods, to the playground, and everywhere else you went. You carved your initials into trees. You played games that involved throwing the blade into the dirt. You sharpened sticks into spears. Today, a child carrying a knife to school would face immediate suspension or expulsion under zero-tolerance weapon policies. In the 1960s, half the boys in your class had one in their front pocket, and the teacher knew it. Number 70. The backyard trampoline with no net, no padding, and 4 kids bouncing at the same time. The backyard trampoline of the 1970s and 1980s was a bare steel frame with exposed springs and a taut jumping surface, surrounded by nothing. No enclosure net, no spring covers, no soft edge padding, and the unwritten rule of the neighborhood was that everyone jumped at once. 4 or 5 kids on a single trampoline meant collisions, double bounces that launched the smallest child into the air without warning, and landings that missed the surface entirely and came down on the steel frame or the springs. A foot caught between 2 coils could twist an ankle. A bad bounce could send a child over the side and onto the lawn from 5 feet up. The springs themselves were pinch traps that grabbed skin and hair. Parents watched from inside and occasionally yelled at everyone to take turns. Nobody ever did. Number 69. Ghost in the graveyard after dark. This was hide and seek played at night, in the dark, across multiple yards, with no boundaries and no adult supervision. One kid counted while everyone else scattered into the shadows of the neighborhood. You hid behind bushes, under porches, in the gap between garages, or flat on your stomach in the tall grass of a neighbor's yard. The seeker moved through the darkness, calling out when they spotted someone, and when the ghost was found, everyone sprinted for the home base at full speed, through pitch-black yards full of garden hoses, tree roots, low fences, and everything else you could not see at a dead run in the dark. Tripping was guaranteed. Crashing into a fence post or a clothesline pole was a matter of when, not if. The game lasted until someone's mother finally called them inside, or until somebody limped home with a twisted ankle and a torn shirt. It was the best game in the neighborhood, and no one played it during the day. Number 68. The tire swing that spun until your vision went gray. A tire swing was a large rubber tire hung from a single rope or chain attached to a high branch. Unlike a regular swing that moved in a predictable arc, a tire swing could spin freely in every direction, and kids exploited that by twisting the rope as tight as it would go and then letting it unwind at full speed. The spinning was fast enough to blur the yard around you. Some kids rode inside the tire. Others sat on top of it and held the rope, which was worse because when the spinning finally slowed and the nausea hit, you were 6 feet off the ground with no easy way to get down without falling. The tire itself was heavy, and if it swung into a bystander, the impact could knock a small child off their feet. Nobody limited the spinning. Nobody monitored how green the rider looked. You just twisted it tight and let it rip. Number 67. Exploring the storm drain after a heavy rain. Every neighborhood had a storm drain entrance, usually a concrete tunnel just wide enough for a child to crouch inside. After a rainstorm, kids crawled in. The tunnel was dark, wet, slippery, and carried water that was still flowing from the runoff. There were no lights, there was no ventilation. There was no way to know if more rain was coming upstream, which could turn a trickle into a current strong enough to knock you down and sweep you forward. Kids explored these tunnels for the same reason they explored anything, because the opening was right there and nobody told them not to. Inside, the air was cool and echoed. Outside, nobody knew where they had gone. A slip on the algae-covered concrete could mean a cracked head with no one around to help. Today, storm drain openings in most municipalities are graded or fenced. Back then, they were wide-open invitations. Number 66. Playing on the construction site after the workers went home for the day. An unfinished house or a half-built strip mall was an irresistible playground. Kids climbed the exposed framing. They walked across floor joists with no subfloor beneath them. They balanced on foundation walls and jumped between stacked lumber. Loose nails poked out of every board. Open trenches and uncovered basement holes waited at ground level. Stacks of drywall and bags of concrete mix became forts and obstacles. The sites were rarely fenced off in any serious way, and even when they were, a determined 10-year-old could find a way in. Construction workers would sometimes find footprints in wet concrete on Monday morning and know exactly what had happened over the weekend. A fall from the second-story framing or a nail through a sneaker was a real possibility every time a kid set foot on that site. Nobody called it trespassing. It was just where the interesting things were. Number 65. Riding on the handlebars of a friend's bicycle. If your friend had a bike and you did not, you sat on the handlebars while they pedaled. It was the standard transportation arrangement for half the kids in the neighborhood. The passenger sat facing forward, legs dangling on either side of the front wheel, gripping the handlebar stem for balance while the rider behind them tried to steer around the extra weight. Visibility was terrible. Balance was worse. A pothole or a sharp turn could dump both riders onto the pavement in a tangle of arms, legs, and spinning wheels. The front wheel occasionally caught a pant leg or a shoelace and locked up without warning, sending everyone over the front end. There were no pegs, no passenger seats, and no helmets. You simply climbed on, held tight, and trusted the person pedaling to keep both of you upright. Number 64. Building forts in the woods with scavenged lumber and rusty nails. The neighborhood fort was a rite of construction. Kids dragged old boards, broken pallets, and discarded plywood from trash piles and vacant lots deep into the trees, and they hammered it all together with whatever nails they could find and whatever tool they could borrow from a garage. The nails were often bent. The hammer was too heavy. The boards were split and splintered. The finished product leaned at angles that no building inspector would have approved, and the floor, if there was one, was a single sheet of warped plywood balanced on rocks. Tetanus was a genuine risk. A rusted nail through the sole of a sneaker was so common that most kids had at least one puncture wound scar on the bottom of a foot. But the fort was yours. You built it with your own hands, and the fact that it might collapse was just part of the experience. Number 63. Rope climbing in gym class with nothing but a hardwood floor beneath you. The gym class rope climb was a staple of physical education from the 1950s through the 1980s. A thick rope hung from the ceiling of the gymnasium, sometimes 20 feet up, and students were expected to climb it hand over hand to the top. There was no crash mat below. There was no harness. There was no spotter. If your grip failed or your arms gave out, you fell straight down onto a polished hardwood floor from whatever height you had reached. Some kids made it to the top and rang the bell. Others stalled halfway up, hung there trembling, and slid back down with friction burns on their palms and the inside of their thighs. The gym teacher stood at the bottom, stopwatch in hand, and told you to try harder. Nobody questioned whether it was safe. It was gym class. You climbed. Number 62. Chemistry sets that came with real chemicals. The chemistry sets sold to children in the 1950s and 1960s were not the watered-down kits sitting on shelves today. A Gilbert chemistry set, or a Skillcraft set, came with glass test tubes, an alcohol burner, and chemicals that would now require a hazmat certification to handle. Sodium ferrocyanide, ammonium nitrate, potassium permanganate, powdered sulfur. You mixed them on the kitchen table, heated them over an open flame, and if you followed the included instruction booklet, you could produce colored smoke, small controlled reactions, and foul-smelling gases that cleared the room. If you went off book, which most kids eventually did, the results ranged from stained countertops to singed eyebrows. The whole idea was that children would learn science by doing real science, and the assumption was that a 10-year-old with a booklet and a sense of curiosity could be trusted around volatile compounds. Today, those same chemicals are restricted or removed entirely from consumer products. Number 61. Chasing the mosquito spray truck on your bicycle. Even after DDT was phased out, mosquito abatement trucks continued rolling through neighborhoods using other chemical formulations, and children continued chasing them. The truck moved slowly, the fog poured out the back, and kids on bikes pedaled directly into the plume, laughing as the mist swallowed them whole. Number 6 kids ran behind the truck on foot with their arms out. Others rode their neighbors' bikes in circles inside the cloud until they could not see the curb. The chemicals in use varied by municipality and by decade, but the behavior was the same everywhere. Nobody stopped the children. Nobody warned them. The truck was an event, something exciting that broke up a boring summer evening, and riding through the fog was the whole point. Today, mosquito spray trucks still operate in many communities, but they often announce their routes in advance and advise residents to stay indoors with windows closed. Number 60. Sledding straight into the road at the bottom of the hill. The best sledding hills in any town were the ones that ended at a street. A long, steep slope with a flat runout that carried you right across the pavement was the ideal run, and the fact that cars drove on that street was a problem you dealt with in real time. Someone stood at the bottom and yelled if a car was coming. Sometimes. Other times you just aimed and hoped. Kids on metal runner sleds, plastic discs, and flattened cardboard boxes shot across the road at speeds that gave them no chance of stopping if something went wrong. A car rounding the corner at the wrong moment was a genuine possibility that everyone acknowledged and nobody did anything to prevent. The thrill was the speed, the wind, and the fact that the whole thing felt slightly out of control. Sandbags and barriers at the bottom of sledding hills are a modern invention. Back then, the road was just where the ride ended. Number 59. Babysitting your younger siblings at 10 years old. In many families in the 1960s and 1970s, a 10-year-old was considered old enough to watch a baby or a toddler alone in the house. Both parents left for work or for an evening out, and the oldest child was in charge. That child heated bottles, changed diapers, settled arguments, managed bedtime, and handled anything that went wrong between the front door closing and the headlights pulling back into the driveway hours later. There was no training course. There was no emergency contact pinned to the refrigerator beyond a neighbor's phone number. If the baby cried, you figured it out. If someone fell and got hurt, you assessed the damage yourself. Today, many states have laws or guidelines establishing minimum ages for children to be left home alone, and leaving a 10-year-old in charge of an infant would raise serious legal questions. Back then, it was just the oldest kid's job. Number 58. The slip and slide laid out across a yard full of bumps, roots, and rocks. Wham-O introduced the slip and slide in 1961, and within a few summers it was one of the most popular backyard toys in the country. The concept was simple. A long sheet of yellow vinyl unrolled across the grass. A garden hose attached to one end sent a thin stream of water down the surface, and you threw yourself onto it at a full sprint. The advertising showed children gliding across perfectly flat, perfectly green lawns. The reality was different. Most yards had exposed tree roots, small rocks, patches of bare dirt, and uneven ground. The vinyl shifted and bunched up. The water pressure was never quite enough to keep the whole surface slick, so halfway down the slide you hit a dry patch and your skin stuck to the plastic and you skidded to a stop with a friction burn across your chest or your stomach. Older kids and teenagers used it too, despite the fact that it was designed for small children. Neck and spinal injuries from teenagers diving headfirst onto a thin sheet of plastic over hard ground sent enough people to the emergency room that the product eventually carried serious warnings about age limits in diving. But in the 1960s and 1970s, those warnings did not exist. You just ran, dove, and slid across whatever surface your yard happened to have underneath. Belly burns, grass stains, and the occasional bloody knee were considered the normal price of a summer afternoon. The idea that a parent might inspect the ground for hazards before laying it out would have struck most families as absurd. Number 57. Playing Mumbledy-Peg with a real knife. Mumbledy-Peg was a knife-throwing game played by children across the United States for generations. The simplest version involved flipping an open pocket knife off your fingertips, your wrist, your elbow, or the top of your head, trying to make it stick blade first into the dirt. More advanced versions had you throwing the knife between your own spread fingers or between the feet of another player standing a few feet away. The loser had to pull a peg out of the ground with their teeth. The game required a sharp knife, a steady hand, and a willingness to accept that a bad throw could land the blade in your foot or someone else's. Nobody supervised it. Nobody stopped to consider whether children should be throwing sharpened steel at the ground between each other's shoes. It was just a game you played in the backyard when you had a knife and nothing else to do. Number 56. Cherry bombs. The cherry bomb was a small, round, red firecracker with a fuse sticking out the top, and it packed considerably more powder than the standard string firecracker that kids popped on the 4th of July. Cherry bombs were loud enough to set off car alarms that had not been invented yet and powerful enough to blow apart a metal mailbox or crack a toilet bowl. Kids dropped them into puddles, stuffed them into watermelons, tossed them into trash cans, and occasionally flushed them down toilets in school bathrooms. The blast was sharp and concussive, and a cherry bomb going off in your hand could cause real injury to fingers and palms. They were banned for consumer sale in the United States in 1966, but they continued circulating through back channels and roadside fireworks stands in border states for years afterward. Getting your hands on one was a matter of knowing the right older kid. Number 55. Lighting bottle rockets and shooting them from your bare hand. A bottle rocket was a small rocket on a stick, designed to be launched from a glass bottle that held the stick upright. That was the intended method. What kids actually did was hold the stick between their fingers, light the fuse, and aim it at a target, which was usually another kid. The rocket ignited with a hiss, launched from your hand at an unpredictable angle, and exploded a few seconds later with a sharp pop. Accuracy was non-existent. The flight path was erratic. A rocket that veered off course could hit someone in the face or land in dry grass and start a fire. Burns on the hand holding the stick were almost guaranteed if you did not release at exactly the right moment. Every 4th of July, neighborhoods across America turned into low-grade war zones of whistling rockets fired from the fists of children who had no business holding a lit explosive. Nobody intervened. It was the 4th. Number 54. Roman candle fights. A Roman candle was a tube that fired a series of flaming balls into the sky, one after another, each one arcing upward with a thump and a trail of sparks. The intended use was to hold it at arm's length and enjoy the light show. What actually happened was that groups of kids aimed them at each other and fired. 2 or 3 children on each side, Roman candles extended like swords, launching fireballs across the yard in the dark. The projectiles were hot enough to burn skin and clothing on contact. A direct hit to the eye was a possibility that everyone acknowledged and nobody let stop the fun. The fights usually ended when someone got singed badly enough to quit, or when the last candle burned out. Every year, emergency rooms reported burns and eye injuries from Roman candle misuse. In the 1970s, it was just how you ended the night on July 4th. Number 53. The pellet gun and the freedom to shoot whatever you wanted. A pellet gun, or a BB gun, was one of the defining possessions of boyhood in mid-century America. By the age of 10 or 11, a significant number of boys owned one, and they used it constantly. They shot at tin cans, glass bottles, fence posts, birds, squirrels, frogs, and with regrettable frequency, each other. A pump-action pellet rifle could generate enough velocity to break skin, crack a window, or take out an eye at close range. The rules, such as they were, amounted to a single instruction from your father: do not point it at anyone. The instruction was universally ignored within a week. BB gun wars in the woods were common, with kids crouching behind trees and firing at each other with guns that could and did leave welts and draw blood. Today, pellet guns are treated as weapons in most jurisdictions. Back then, they were sold in the sporting goods aisle right next to the baseball gloves. Number 52. Standing on the front seat of the car while your father drove. Before child safety seats, before mandatory seatbelt laws, and before airbags, small children rode in the front seat of the car standing up. A toddler stood on the bench seat between the driver and the passenger, one hand on the dashboard, face pressed against the windshield, watching the road go by from a vantage point that put them directly in the path of everything that could go wrong. A sudden stop sent the child forward into the dash or the windshield. A sharp turn toppled them sideways. Your father's arm shooting out across your chest at a red light was the only restraint system in the vehicle. Some children sat on a parent's lap and held the steering wheel while the car was moving, which was not an emergency but a form of entertainment. Today, a child under a certain age cannot legally ride in the front seat at all. Back then, the front seat was the preferred seat and standing was perfectly normal. Number 51. Playing outside with toy guns that looked exactly like the real thing. The toy guns of the 1960s and 1970s were made of metal and wood and bore an almost perfect resemblance to actual firearms. A toy revolver looked like a revolver. A toy rifle looked like a rifle. There was no orange tip, no bright color, and no obvious marking to distinguish it from a real weapon at a distance. Kids carried these through neighborhoods, pointed them at each other, aimed at passing cars, and staged elaborate gunfights in front yards and back alleys that, from a block away, would have been indistinguishable from actual violence. Nobody thought twice about it. The idea that a child holding a realistic toy gun could be mistaken for a genuine threat was not part of the cultural conversation. Today, federal law requires a blaze orange plug on the barrel of every toy firearm sold in the United States. Back then, the toys looked real because looking real was the whole point. Being none. Number 50. Eating whatever berries you found growing wild and hoping for the best. If you spent any time in the woods or along a fence line, you ate things off the bush. Wild, blackberries, mulberries, crab apples, and anything that looked like it might be a strawberry went straight into your mouth without a second thought. Nobody consulted a field guide. Nobody checked whether the bright red berry on that low shrub was edible or poisonous. You tasted it, and if it did not taste terrible, you ate more. Some kids ate honeysuckle nectar by pulling the stamens through the base of the flower. Others chewed on sassafras roots they dug out of the dirt. The possibility of eating something toxic was real, and every few years a story made the rounds about a child somewhere getting sick from a plant they should not have touched. But for most kids, if it grew and it looked like food, it was food. If you ever ate something off a bush or a vine and only wondered afterward whether it was safe, that memory probably never left you. Number 49. Swimming in the abandoned quarry. Every region had one. A flooded gravel pit or limestone quarry filled with cold, deep, still water and surrounded by rock walls that dropped straight into the pool below. There were no lifeguards. There were no posted depth markers. The water was opaque and you had no idea what was beneath the surface. Submerged machinery, rusted metal, jagged rock ledges, and sudden drop-offs were all real hazards that you could not see from the surface. Kids swam there anyway. They jumped from the rock ledges, sometimes from heights of 20 or 30 feet, into water they could not see the bottom of. The cold alone was enough to cramp your muscles if you stayed in too long. Drownings at abandoned quarries were reported with terrible regularity across the country, and most of the victims were teenagers. Warning signs went up and were ignored. Fences went up and were cut. The quarry was just too good a swimming hole to leave alone. Number 48. Building homemade potato cannons in the garage. The potato cannon was a length of PVC pipe, a combustion chamber made from a wider section of the same pipe, and a spark source, usually a grill igniter wired into the back end. You stuffed a potato into the barrel, sprayed hairspray into the chamber for fuel, screwed on the cap, and hit the igniter. The potato launched with a deep thump and flew 50 or 60 yards across the field. Some versions used compressed air instead of combustion, but the hairspray model was the classic. The pressure inside the chamber was enough to split the PVC if it was too thin, too old, or too old and all dick. Brittle, and a catastrophic failure sent sharp plastic fragments in every direction. Nobody wore safety glasses. Nobody calculated the chamber pressure. You just built the thing, loaded it, and fired it into the sky. In several states today, a potato cannon is legally classified as a destructive device. Number 47. The backyard swimming pool with no fence and no lock. In the 1960s and 1970s, a family with a backyard pool often had nothing more than the pool itself sitting in the open yard. No fence surrounded it. No gate kept children out. No cover was placed over the water when it was not in use. The neighbor's children, the kids from down the block, and anyone passing through could walk right up to the edge. On hot days, kids swam unsupervised for hours while the adults were inside, and the only lifeguard was whoever happened to be the oldest child in the water. Toddlers wandered near the edge with no barrier between them and the deep end. Drowning was, and still is, a leading cause of death for young children, and unfenced pools were a major contributor. Today, nearly every municipality in the country requires a fence with a self-latching gate around any residential pool. Back then, the pool was just a hole in the ground with water in it, and the gate was your mother telling you to be careful. Number 46. Diving off the bridge into the river. Every small town near a river or a creek had a bridge that teenagers jumped from. You climbed the railing, looked down at the water, guessed whether it was deep enough, and jumped. Some bridges were 10 feet above the surface, others were closer to 30. The depth of the water changed with the season, the rainfall, and the current. What was deep enough in June might be dangerously shallow in August. Submerged rocks, fallen trees, and shifting sandbars were invisible from the top of the railing. You took the jump on faith and on the word of whoever had jumped the week before. Spinal injuries from shallow water, diving are among the most devastating recreational injuries documented in emergency medicine. But from the top of that railing, the only calculation that mattered was whether you were brave enough to step off. Nobody posted a warning. The bridge was just there, and the river was just below it. Number 45. The wood-burning kit with an actual branding iron for a tip. The wood-burning kit was marketed directly to children as a craft toy, and it came with a pen-shaped tool that heated a metal tip to several hundred degrees, hot enough to scorch wood, cork, and leather on contact. There was no temperature control. There was no automatic shutoff. You plugged it in, waited a few minutes for the tip to reach full heat, and then pressed it against a piece of scrap wood to burn letters, pictures, or designs into the surface. The tip glowed faintly orange when it was ready, and the smell of burning wood filled whatever room you were working in. The tool looked and felt exactly like a soldering iron, because functionally that is what it was, and it was handed to children as young as 8. Burns were practically guaranteed. The tip stayed hot for several minutes after you unplugged it, and setting it down on a table left a scorch mark. Touching the barrel by accident left a blister. Dropping it onto your lap while adjusting your grip left a memory that lasted longer than the mark. The instruction booklet offered a single caution about the heat of the tip and then moved directly into the craft projects, which assumed a level of patience and motor control that most children did not possess. Some kits included interchangeable tips of different shapes, which meant unscrewing a burning hot metal point with your fingers and replacing it with another one while the tool was still plugged in. There was no safety guard. There was no insulated holder. The tool sat on the edge of the table, cord dangling, tip exposed, for the entire duration of the project. Today, similar tools exist but are marketed to adults, with safety stands, heat guards, and explicit age warnings. In the 1960s and 1970s, the box had a picture of a 10-year-old using it and a price tag under $5. Number 44. Backyard archery with a real bow and real arrows. Archery sets sold at department stores and through mail-order catalogs put actual bows and arrows with pointed metal tips into the hands of children who had no formal training and no adult supervision. You set up a hay, bale, or a cardboard box in the backyard, stood 15 or 20 feet away, and fired. The arrows flew unpredictably. They sailed over the target, skipped off the ground, or deflected sideways into the neighbor's yard. Some kids fired straight up into the air to see how high the arrow would go, and then scrambled to get out of the way when it came back down. Stray arrows embedded themselves in fences, garage doors, and the siding of houses. The possibility of an arrow striking a person was constantly present and universally ignored. Nobody wore protective gear, nobody set up a range with a proper backstop. You just stood in the yard and shot at whatever target you had set up until the arrows were lost in the bushes. Number 43. Sitting on the roof of the house and watching the world go by. Getting onto the roof was not difficult for a determined child. You climbed the porch railing to the porch roof, then pulled yourself up the slope to the main roof line and sat there with your legs dangling over the edge. Some kids read books on the roof. Others watched thunderstorms roll in. Some just liked the view. The height was anywhere from 12 to 20 feet above the ground, depending on the house, and the surface was pitched shingles that got slippery when wet or covered in morning dew. One wrong step, one startled flinch, one careless lean too far backward, and the fall would have been serious. Nobody wore a harness. Nobody tied off to anything. You were sitting on a sloped surface at the height of a second-story window with nothing but air between you and the driveway below. Some parents yelled when they found out. Most shrugged because they had done the same thing when they were young. Number 42. Getting your ears pierced at home with a sewing needle and an ice cube. Professional ear piercing at a jewelry store or a doctor's office cost money, and for a lot of families that expense was unnecessary when you could do it at the kitchen table for free. The method was simple and crude. An older sister, a mother, or a friend held an ice cube against your earlobe until it went numb, then pushed a sewing needle straight through the skin and threaded a starter earring into the hole. There was no sterilization beyond rubbing alcohol on the needle. There was no sterile stud. There was no trained technician. The pain was sharp and immediate once the ice wore off, and infections were common in the days that followed. Some ears healed clean. Others swelled, turned red, and oozed until the earring was removed and the hole closed over. Nobody went to the doctor for an infected ear piercing. You just cleaned it with peroxide and waited. Number 41. Sleeping in the back of the station wagon on long road trips. Family road trips in the 1960s and 1970s meant piling the kids into the back of a station wagon with a couple of pillows and a blanket and driving through the night. There were no car seats, no booster seats, and most of the time, nobody even bothered with the lap belts. The back of a Ford Country Squire or a Chevrolet Kingswood had a flat cargo area behind the rear seat, and kids spread out back there like it was a bedroom, rolling from one side to the other every time the car took a curve. Some families folded the rear seats down to create one long sleeping platform. You woke up with your face pressed against the rear window, a dog on your legs, and no idea what state you were in. If the driver stopped short, you slid forward into the back of the seat. If there was an accident, there was nothing between you and the metal frame of the car. It was just how families traveled, and a generation of children fell asleep to the hum of highway tires and the crackle of AM radio coming from the front seat. Number 40. The rock fight. Not every neighborhood game was sanctioned or organized. Sometimes two groups of kids just picked up rocks and threw them at each other. The rock fight was exactly what it sounded like, an unstructured battle between two sides using whatever stones they could pick up off the ground. Some rocks were pebbles, others were large enough to do real damage if they connected. Kids threw from behind trees, from the top of a hill, from across a ditch, and the only rule was to keep throwing until someone quit or someone got hit hard enough to end the game. Cuts, bruises, and welts were the standard outcome. A direct hit to the head with a decent-sized rock could cause a concussion or, worse. Nobody organized these fights. They erupted out of boredom, escalated quickly, and ended when someone went home bleeding. No adult was ever consulted. You just went home, cleaned up, and did not mention it at dinner. Number 39. Wrestling on the asphalt playground. Recess in the 1960s and 1970s often included informal wrestling matches on the blacktop, where two kids grabbed each other and tried to force the other to the ground. The surface was rough asphalt, the kind that ripped skin on contact, and a hard takedown left road rash across elbows, knees, and forearms that took weeks to heal. There were no mats. There were no rules about headlocks or joint manipulation. You grabbed, twisted, pushed, and slammed until one person gave up or the teacher finally noticed and told you to knock it off. Some teachers watched and let it go unless blood appeared. Others looked the other way entirely. The asphalt was unforgiving, and every boy who went through elementary school in that era has at least one scar from being thrown onto a playground surface that was never designed for anything softer than the sole of a shoe. Number 38. Playing with mercury from a broken thermometer. When a glass thermometer broke, and they broke often, a small silver bead of mercury rolled out onto the floor or the countertop. Instead of calling a hazmat team, which is what a modern protocol would require, your mother told you to pick it up, and you did, with your bare hands. You pushed the little silver ball around on the table, watching it split into smaller beads and then merge back together when you nudged them close enough. It was mesmerizing. Some kids kept it in a jar, some rolled it across their school desk during class. The metallic liquid felt cool and impossibly heavy for its size, and it moved like nothing else you had ever touched. Mercury is a potent neurotoxin. Chronic exposure causes tremors, memory problems, and kidney damage, but in the 1950s and 1960s it was a curiosity. A broken thermometer turned into an afternoon of entertainment, and it sat in jelly jars on bedroom shelves until someone eventually threw it away. Number 37. Smear the Queer. The name alone would stop any modern school board cold, but the game itself was played at virtually every recess in the 1960s and 1970s under that exact name. The rules were savage and simple. One kid held a football, and every other kid on the field tried to tackle them. There was no team. There was no goal line. There was only the ball carrier and the mob. The person holding the ball ran until they were brought down by force, and whoever recovered the ball became the new target. Pile-ons were routine. Elbows to the ribs were standard. Getting driven face first into the ground by 6 kids at once was the expected conclusion of every possession. Injuries were constant and rarely reported. The game thrived because it required no setup, no equipment beyond a single ball, and no adult involvement. It was pure, uncomplicated, and deeply physical, and nobody questioned any of it. Number 36. The game of stretch with real pocket knives. Stretch was a knife game played by 2 kids standing a few feet apart, facing each other. One player threw a knife into the ground near the other player's foot, and the other player had to move their foot to where the knife stuck. Then they threw back. The game continued, with each throw landing farther from the opponent's current stance, until someone could not stretch far enough to reach the knife's landing spot and fell over. A bad throw could embed the blade in a shoe, a shin, or the top of a foot. A really bad throw could miss the ground entirely. The game required a sharp knife and a willingness to stand still while someone threw it at the ground between your feet. Nobody questioned whether this was an appropriate activity for children. You played it because you had a knife and someone to play with, and because it was better than standing around doing nothing. Number 35. Clacker balls. Also called click-clacks, kerbangers, or knockers, clacker balls were 2 heavy acrylic or glass spheres attached to a string with a handle in the middle. The idea was to swing them up and down so they clacked together above and below your hand in a rhythmic pattern. The problem was that the balls were hard, heavy, and moving fast, and they hit your wrist, your knuckles, and your forearm with painful regularity until you got the rhythm right. Worse, the acrylic versions could shatter on impact, sending sharp fragments into the air and into the face of whoever was swinging them. Reports of shattered clacker balls injuring children led to a recall of certain models in the early 1970s, and the Consumer Product Safety Commission flagged them as hazardous. But by then, millions had already been sold, and kids were already swinging them in every schoolyard in America, unaware that the toy in their hand could disintegrate at any moment. Number 34. The metal jungle gym that towered over the playground. The jungle gym of the 1950s and 1960s was a skeletal frame of steel pipes bolted together into a dome or a cube that stood 10, 12, or even 15 feet off the ground. Kids climbed to the very top and sat there, legs dangling, looking down at a surface of packed dirt or concrete below. There was no netting. There was no guardrail. There was nothing at the top to prevent a child from losing their balance and falling the full height of the structure onto a surface with no give. The bars themselves were smooth steel, which became slippery when wet and scalding hot in direct sunlight. Kids hung upside down from the highest bar, swung between rungs, and competed to see who could climb fastest to the top. Falls happened regularly, and the injuries ranged from scraped palms to broken bones to the occasional head injury that sent a child to the hospital. By the 1990s, most of these structures had been torn out and replaced with lower, safer equipment over impact-absorbing surfaces. In their time, they were the tallest thing on the playground, and every kid wanted to reach the top. Number 33. No child-proof caps on anything in the medicine cabinet. The child-resistant closure on medicine bottles became a federal requirement in 1970 under the Poison Prevention Packaging Act, But compliance took years, and older bottles without safety caps remained in medicine cabinets across the country long after the Chia law changed. Before that, every bottle of aspirin, every bottle of cough syrup, and every container of prescription medication in the house opened with a simple twist. Children could and did open them. Accidental poisoning from household medications was a leading cause of injury and death in young children throughout the 1950s and 1960s. A curious toddler could open a bottle of pills that looked like candy, pour them out, and swallow a handful before anyone noticed. The medicine cabinet was within reach. The bottles were easy to open, and the assumption was that children simply knew not to touch them, which of course they did not. Number 32. Playing chicken on bicycles. Two kids on bikes faced each other at opposite ends of the block, pedaled as hard as they could directly at each other, and the first one to swerve lost. The closing speed of two children on bicycles heading at each other was fast enough to make any head-on collision genuinely dangerous. A handlebar to the ribs, a fork to the wheel, or a shoulder-to-shoulder impact at full pedal could send both riders to the pavement in a heap of tangled metal and scraped skin. Some kids played on the sidewalk, others played in the middle of the street. The audience stood on the curb and cheered until someone turned away, or someone did not, and the impact happened. Nobody wore a helmet. Nobody wore pads. You just pedaled, aimed for the other kid, and tested who had more nerve. The loser swerved. The winner bled, and both of them did it again the next day. Number 31. Hitchhiking to the next town as a teenager. Through the 1950s, the 1960s, and well into the 1970s, sticking out your thumb on the side of a road and climbing into a stranger's car was an ordinary way for a teenager to get from one place to another. You did not need a reason that adults would approve of. You might be heading to a friend's house 3 towns over, or trying to get to the beach, or just going somewhere because there was nothing to do at home. Drivers pulled over without hesitation. Some were neighbors, some were strangers passing through. You got in, sat in the passenger seat, and made small talk until they dropped you off wherever you were headed. Girls hitchhiked, boys hitchhiked. Groups of teenagers hitchhiked together and split up among different cars when they had to. Most parents were aware of it and did not object because they had done the same thing at the same age. The idea that a stranger in a car was automatically a threat had not yet taken root in the national consciousness. That started to change in the late 1970s and early 1980s, when a series of high-profile crimes involving hitchhikers made national news and shifted public perception almost overnight. By the mid-1980s, hitchhiking had gone from routine to reckless in the eyes of most American parents. Public service announcements warned against it. Schools discouraged it. Within a single generation, a transportation method that millions of teenagers had relied on without a second thought became something that most parents today would consider unthinkable. Number 30. Sleeping outside overnight with no adult anywhere near you. Camping in the backyard was a childhood staple, but plenty of kids took it further. You and a friend pitched a tent in the woods, in a field, or beside a creek a mile from home, and you stayed there all night with no adult, no phone, and no way to call for help if something went wrong. You built a fire, told stories, ate whatever food you had stuffed into your backpack, and fell asleep listening to sounds you could not identify. The darkness was total. The nearest house might have been a quarter-mile away. If a storm rolled in, you either rode it out in the tent or ran home through the rain in the dark. Some kids slept on the roof of the house. Others dragged sleeping bags to the tree fort and stayed until dawn. The idea that children might need an adult present to sleep outdoors would have been met with blank stares. You were outside. You were fine. That was all anyone needed to know. Number 29. Playing along the railroad tracks. The railroad tracks that ran through or near most American towns were a magnet for children. Kids walked the rails like a balance beam. They placed pennies on the track and came back after the train passed to find them flattened into thin copper discs. They explored the rail yard, climbed on parked freight cars, and sat on the ties throwing rocks at the signal posts. Some kids built forts in the weeds alongside the tracks and spent entire afternoons within feet of active rail lines. A freight train moving at speed is nearly silent from a distance, and by the time you heard it, you had very little time to move. The tracks vibrated before the horn sounded, and that vibration in the soles of your shoes was sometimes the only warning. Trespassing on railroad property was technically illegal, but enforcement was rare, and the tracks were right there, running through the middle of everything. For a kid looking for an adventure, they were impossible to ignore. Number 28. Backyard boxing matches with real punches and no gloves. When an argument between two kids could not be settled with words, it was sometimes settled with fists, and the adults in the neighborhood did not always stop it. Some fathers actively encouraged it. Two boys stood in the backyard or in the alley, squared up, and swung at each other bare-knuckled until one of them quit, or both of them were too tired to continue. There were no rounds, there were no weight classes, there was no referee beyond the circle of neighborhood kids watching from the edges. A punch to the nose drew blood, a punch to the stomach doubled you over. A wild swing that connected with the side of the head left your ears ringing for an hour. When it was over, both kids shook hands, or they did not, and the neighborhood moved on. The idea of intervening in a fight between children was considered unnecessary by most adults of the era. You settled your differences and you learned from the outcome. Number 27. Jumping off the garage roof into a pile of leaves. Every autumn, after the leaves were raked into a tall pile in the driveway or the backyard, someone decided to jump into it from above. The garage roof was the preferred launch point. You climbed up, stood at the edge, looked down at the pile below, and jumped. If the pile was deep enough and positioned correctly, you landed in a soft cushion of dry leaves and rolled out laughing. If the pile was thinner than it looked, or if it had shifted in the wind, or if you misjudged the angle, you hit the ground underneath with enough force to knock the wind out of you, or worse. A garage roof is typically 8 to 10 feet off the ground. A child jumping from that height into an unverified landing zone with no preparation was taking a genuine risk every single time. But the thrill of the fall and the crunch of the leaves was worth it, and nobody told you to stop until somebody got hurt. Number 26. Playing in the hayloft of a barn. For kids who grew up near farmland, the hayloft was the ultimate playground. You climbed the wooden ladder, hauled yourself up through the opening, and found yourself in a dim, dusty space stacked with bales of hay and straw that reached from floor to rafter. Kids jumped between bales, built tunnels through the stacks, swung from ropes tied to the ceiling beams, and leaped from the loft door into the hay wagon parked below. The drop from the loft to the barn floor was often 15 or 20 feet, and the only thing preventing a fall was your own footing on loose hay. The dust alone was thick enough to trigger an asthma attack. The old wood was dry and the hay was flammable, and more than a few barns were lost when children brought matches or lanterns into a space that could go up in seconds. Farm accidents involving children and haylofts were reported with grim regularity throughout the mid-century decades. But for the kids who played there, the loft was a castle, a spaceship, and a fortress, all at once. Number 25. Riding your bicycle miles from home along the shoulder of a county road. When the swimming spot, the fishing hole, or a friend's house was 5 or 6 miles away, you rode your bike to get there, not on a bike path, not on a quiet side street, on the gravel shoulder of a 2-lane highway where cars and trucks passed at 50 or 60 miles an hour a few feet from your left elbow. There was no bike lane. There was no shoulder rumble strip. There was just you, a bicycle with no reflectors and no lights, and a road that was not designed with a child in mind. A moment of distraction, a car drifting right, or a patch of loose gravel could send you into the ditch or into traffic. You pedaled with your head down, you listened for engines coming up behind you, and you stayed as far right as the road allowed. Nobody drove you. Nobody followed behind in a car. You just rode. and you made it back before dark, or you did not. Number 24. The paddle in the principal's office. Corporal punishment was standard disciplinary practice in American public schools throughout the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s. A child who misbehaved in class, talked back, or broke a school rule could be sent to the principal's office, where a wooden paddle hung on the wall or sat in the desk drawer. The paddle was flat, solid, and heavy, sometimes drilled with holes to reduce air resistance and increase the sting. The child bent over, grabbed the far edge of a chair or touched their toes, and the principal swung. Some schools required a witness, others did not. Some allowed teachers to paddle students in the classroom in front of everyone. The pain was immediate and sharp, and the humiliation often lasted longer than the welt. Parents were rarely informed in advance, and most of them would have supported it anyway. Today, corporal punishment is banned in public schools in the majority of states. In the 1960s, the paddle was as much a part of the school as the chalkboard. Number 23. Playing inside abandoned buildings and construction sites after hours. If a house sat empty on the block, or if a new building was going up at the edge of the neighborhood, every kid within a mile treated it as a playground. You climbed through broken windows into abandoned houses. You explored half-finished construction sites on weekends when the workers were gone, walking across exposed floor joists, climbing scaffolding, and jumping between stacks of lumber. There were rusty nails sticking out of every board, open pits where basements were being dug, and no fences or locks that could stop a determined 10-year-old. A tetanus shot after stepping on a nail was practically a childhood milestone. The idea that a construction company might be held liable for an unsupervised child wandering onto the site was not yet the legal reality it is today. You went in, you explored, and you went home with dirty clothes and a story. Number 22. Operating the riding lawnmower at 9 or 10 years old. On a Saturday morning in rural or suburban America, plenty of 9 and 10-year-olds were behind the wheel of a riding mower, cutting the family lawn or the lawn of a neighbor who paid them a few dollars for the job. The mower was a heavy, powerful machine with spinning blades underneath and no roll, bar, no seatbelt, and no kill switch that could be reached by small hands in a panic. Slopes, tree roots, and uneven ground were constant hazards. A rider too small to comfortably reach the pedals could lose control on a hill and tip the mower on top of themselves. The blades did not discriminate between grass and anything else that got underneath, and a foot slipping off the platform into the path of the deck was the kind of accident that ended a summer. Lawnmower injuries involving children remain one of the most common causes of severe extremity injury in minors. Numbers thus. In the 1970s, handing the keys to a fourth grader was just called chores. Number 21. Building a campfire in the woods with no adult present. On summer evenings and on weekend camping trips that had no adults attached to them, kids built fires. They gathered sticks, stacked them in a rough pile, and lit the whole thing with matches they had taken from the kitchen drawer or a lighter they had found in a coat pocket. The fire was for warmth, for roasting marshmallows, for burning things, and mostly for the pure fascination of watching it. Nobody taught fire safety. Nobody cleared the brush in a ring around the pit. Nobody kept a bucket of water nearby. The fire sat in the middle of dry leaves, dead grass, and low-hanging branches, and when a stray ember caught the underbrush, you stomped it out with your sneaker or you ran. Some kids left the fire burning when they went home and hoped it would go out on its own. Most of the time it did. Sometimes it did not. But the campfire was sacred, and building one alone was a mark of independence that every kid aspired to. Number 20. The homemade go-kart powered by a lawnmower engine bolted to a wooden frame. In garages and driveways across America in the 1960s and 1970s, kids built their own vehicles. The frame was scrap lumber or welded angle iron. The wheels came from old wagons or junkyard finds. The engine was pulled from a broken push mower and mounted to the back with bolts and whatever hardware was lying around. There was no roll cage, no seat belt, no kill switch, and the brakes, if they existed at all, were a piece of wood that pressed against a rear tire. You drove it down the street, through vacant lots, and sometimes down hills where the only way to stop was to drag your feet or steer into the grass. The exhaust pipe sat inches from your leg. The chain or belt connecting the engine to the axle was exposed and spinning. Fathers helped build them, and then stood in the yard and watched their kids tear off down the block at speeds that no parent today would allow. Number 19. Car surfing. In neighborhoods and on quiet streets across America, teenagers and older children climbed onto the hood or the roof of a slowly moving car and tried to keep their balance while someone else drove. The car moved at 5, 10, sometimes 20 miles an hour, and the rider on top held on with nothing but their shoes on a smooth metal surface and their hands gripping whatever they could find. A windshield wiper arm, a roof rack, or nothing at all. A turn, a bump, or a tap of the brakes was enough to send the rider off the vehicle and onto the pavement. The injuries from car surfing ranged from road rash and broken bones to traumatic head injuries and death. It was one of the most dangerous things kids did, and it was done casually, for laughs, on a boring afternoon in the driveway. Nobody called it by a clinical name. It was just something you dared your friend to do. Number 18. Riding the back bumper of a car through the snow. In the winter, when the streets were icy and a car came through the neighborhood at slow speed, kids would crouch behind it, grab the rear bumper, and let the car pull them along the ice in their boots or on the soles of their shoes. The driver often had no idea anyone was back there. The child hung on as the car slid them through intersections, around corners, and down streets covered in packed snow and ice. A sudden stop meant slamming face first into the rear of the vehicle. A release at the wrong moment meant sliding out of control across an icy road with no way to steer or stop. In cities with cold winters, this was a common enough sight that some drivers learned to check their mirrors before pulling away from a stop sign. Most did not. The bumpers of that era were chrome steel, sturdy enough to grab. Today, plastic bumper covers and integrated body panels make it nearly impossible. Back then, the bumper was built like a handle, and kids treated it like one. Number 17. Chasing the DDT fogger truck through the neighborhood on your bicycle. In the 1950s and into the 1960s, trucks mounted with chemical foggers drove slowly through residential neighborhoods, spraying thick white clouds of DDT into the air to kill mosquitoes. The cloud was dense, sweet-smelling, and visible for blocks, and kids chased it. They rode their bicycles directly behind the truck, pedaling through the fog, breathing it in, letting it coat their skin and their clothes. Some ran on foot, some stood on the sidewalk and let the cloud wash over them like a wave. Parents watched from porches and did not call their children inside because DDT was promoted as safe and effective, endorsed by the government, and sprayed with the full confidence of public health authorities. Nobody questioned it. The trucks came through on a schedule, and in some towns, children treated the fogger run like the ice cream truck, running out of the house when they heard it coming. It was not until Rachel Carson published Silent Spring in 1962 that the public began to understand the dangers of widespread DDT exposure. The pesticide accumulated in the food chain, thinned the eggshells of birds of prey, and was eventually linked to serious health concerns in humans, including links to liver damage and developmental issues in children. The Environmental Protection Agency banned DDT for most uses in 1972. By then, an entire generation of American children had spent summers running through clouds of a chemical that is now classified as a probable human carcinogen. Nobody warned them. Nobody pulled them out of the fog. It was just the truck that came through on Tuesday evenings, and you chased it because every other kid on the block was chasing it too. Number 16. Playing with matches and a magnifying glass on a sunny afternoon. Every kid with access to a magnifying glass eventually pointed it at the sun and focused the beam onto something flammable. Dry leaves, paper, ants, and the back of a friend's hand were all fair targets. The focused sunlight produced a hot point intense enough to ignite tinder within seconds, and the thrill of starting a fire with nothing but glass and sunlight was irresistible. Matches were even more direct. A box of kitchen matches or a book of paper matches from a restaurant was all a kid needed to set fire to anything within reach. They burned newspaper in the alley. They melted plastic army men on the driveway. They lit firecrackers, model rockets, and small piles of leaves. The connection between unsupervised children and fire was one of the leading causes of house fires and brush fires in mid-century America. Nobody locked the matches away. They sat in the kitchen drawer, next to the rubber bands and the twist ties, available to anyone who could reach the handle. Number 15. Climbing the water tower. The water tower stood at the edge of town, a steel tank on legs rising 100 feet or more above the surrounding landscape. It was the tallest thing in the area, and for that reason alone, teenagers climbed it. The ladder was usually enclosed in a metal cage starting about 10 feet off the ground, which was meant to discourage climbing, but in practice just made the first 10 feet the hardest part. Once past the cage, you climbed straight up on exposed steel rungs with nothing below you but air and the ground getting farther away with every step. At the top, you could see the entire town spread out beneath you, and the wind hit you in a way it did not hit you anywhere else. Some kids painted their names or their graduation year on the tank. Others just sat on the catwalk and looked down. The fall from that height would have been fatal. The rungs were sometimes loose, sometimes rusted, and always slippery when wet. Nobody was supervised. Nobody was roped in. You climbed because it was there, and you came down because you had to. Number 14. Making homemade fireworks and small explosives from household materials. For kids with a curious mind and access to a library or an older brother with a chemistry background, building homemade fireworks was an achievable project. Saltpeter from the garden supply store, sulfur from a hobby shop, and charcoal from the grill gave you the basic components of black powder. Zinc, dust, and sulfur made a flash compound. Model. Rocket engines could be disassembled for their propellant. Match heads could be scraped and packed into a container. The results ranged from a satisfying bang to a genuine explosion that left a crater in the backyard and a ringing in the ears that lasted for hours. Some of these homemade devices were pipe bombs by any legal definition, and the children building them had no idea how close they were to a catastrophic failure. Burns, lacerations, and partial amputations from homemade explosives were documented in emergency rooms across the country throughout the 1960s and 1970s. Today, searching for this kind of information online can trigger a law enforcement response. Back then, the instructions were in books you checked out of the public library. Number 13. Riding in the back of a pickup truck. If your family had a pickup truck, or if your neighbor did, then you rode in the bed. That was simply how it worked. Going to the hardware store meant 2 kids in the cab and 3 more sitting on the wheel wells in the back, legs dangling off the tailgate, wind hitting your face at 40 miles an hour. Families drove to church, to the lake, to drive-in movies with children bouncing around in an open truck bed on 2-lane roads with no guardrails. There were no seatbelts because there were no seats. You held onto the side of the truck or you held onto each other. If the driver hit the brakes hard, you slid forward into the cab wall. If the driver took a turn fast, you grabbed whatever you could. It was so common that nobody commented on it, and law enforcement did not give it a second look. Today, hauling a child unsecured in the back of a moving vehicle would result in a citation in most states and a referral in many. Number 12. The deep end of the public pool with no lifeguard watching your corner. Public pools in the 1960s and 1970s were often understaffed, especially in smaller towns where 1 or 2 teenage lifeguards were responsible for a pool full of dozens of children. The deep end was where the older kids gathered, and the supervision there was thin at best. Kids who could barely swim ventured past the rope on a dare. Others held breath contests on the bottom, staying under long enough to make their friends nervous. Cannonballs from the edge sent waves crashing over the heads of smaller children. The pool was loud, crowded and chaotic on a summer afternoon, and a child struggling in the deep end could easily go unnoticed in the noise. Drowning does not look like drowning in the movies. It is quiet, and it happens fast. The gap between a safe swim and a crisis was measured in seconds, and the lifeguard was often looking the other way. It was just the pool. Everyone went. Nobody thought about it too carefully. Number 11. Full contact neighborhood games with no rules, no adults, and real consequences. Not every game had a name. Sometimes a group of kids just ended up chasing each other across yards, through alleys, over fences, and down embankments in a sprawling, unnamed competition that combined elements of tag, football, wrestling, and survival. The terrain was the entire neighborhood: uneven lawns, gravel driveways, chain-link fences, drainage ditches, and parked cars that served as obstacles to vault over or slide under. There were no teams. There were no timeouts. You ran until someone tackled you, and then you got up and ran again. Injuries were constant and varied. A misjudged fence vault meant landing on a metal post. A slide across a gravel driveway left raw, pebble-embedded skin across your forearms. A collision at full speed between two kids rounding a blind corner left both of them on the ground trying to catch their breath. Nobody kept score. Nobody called it off. The game ended when the last kid standing finally went home. Number 10. The Johnny Reb cannon that fired hard plastic projectiles across the room. The Johnny Reb cannon by Remco was a toy cannon sold in the early 1960s that used a spring-loaded mechanism to fire hard plastic cannonballs across the room with enough force to sting, bruise, and break small objects. The cannon was about 2 feet long, mounted on a wheeled carriage, and designed to look like a Civil War field piece. The projectile was a solid plastic ball roughly the size of a large marble, and it launched with a satisfying crack that meant somebody across the room was about to get hit. Kids aimed them at siblings, at pets, at the form, television screen, and at anything fragile that happened to be in the line of fire. The manufacturer recommended aiming only at the included targets. Nobody followed that recommendation. A direct hit to the eye or the face from a few feet away could cause a real injury, and the cannon was powerful enough that the projectile left dents in drywall. It was one of the most popular toys of its era, and it was functionally a small weapon sold in a toy box. Number 9. Playing tag on the fire escape of an apartment building. For kids who grew up in cities and apartment buildings, the fire escape was the backyard. It was a steel staircase bolted to the outside of the building, 3, 4, 5 stories up, open to the air, with metal railings that a small child could slip through and a drop to the concrete below that got more lethal with every floor. Kids played on the fire escape the way suburban kids played in the yard. They chased each other up and down the flights. They leaned over the railing and yelled at friends on the street. They sat on the top landing with their legs dangling through the bars. A stumble on the metal stairs, a misstep on a wet rung, or a moment of overbalanced leaning could send a child over the railing into open air. In summer, the metal was hot. In winter, it was icy. Year-round, it was a piece of emergency infrastructure that children treated as a jungle gym, because for many of them, it was the only outdoor space they had. Number 8. Crack the whip on ice skates at the frozen pond. If crack the whip on dry ground was dangerous, crack the whip on ice was in a different category entirely. A line of kids on ice skates linked arms. The leader accelerated, and the physics sent the tail end of the line whipping across the ice at a speed that no child could maintain on skates. When the last skater lost their grip or their balance, they went sliding, spinning, and tumbling across the frozen surface with no friction to slow them down. The fall ended when they hit a snowbank, a fence, or the far edge of the pond where the ice was thin. A hard fall on ice can crack a skull, fracture a wrist, or knock a person unconscious, and an unconscious child lying on a frozen pond is a genuine medical emergency. The ponds and lakes that froze in winter were not tested for thickness. Nobody drilled a hole to measure the ice. You just skated until you heard a crack, and then you moved to a different spot and kept skating. Number 7. Getting disciplined by any adult in the neighborhood, not just your own parents. In the 1950s and 1960s, any adult in the neighborhood had implicit authority over any child in the neighborhood. If you misbehaved in front of someone else's mother, she told you to stop, and you stopped. If she thought the offense was serious enough, she marched you home by the arm and told your parents what you had done, and your parents thanked her and then punished you again. There was a collective understanding that children were the responsibility of every adult on the block, and discipline was not something restricted to the biological parents. A neighbor could scold you, ground you from their yard, or in some cases give you a swat on the backside, and your parents would hear about it later and agree it was deserved. Today, an adult disciplining someone else's child would risk a confrontation, a phone call to the police, or a lawsuit. Back then, the village really did raise the child, and nobody questioned it. Number 6. The kerosene lantern inside the backyard fort. The forts that kids built in the woods and in backyards were not just daytime structures. At night, they became hideouts, clubhouses, and overnight camps, and they needed light. The solution, in an era before battery-powered lanterns were cheap or widely available, was a kerosene lantern, a glass chimney lantern burning liquid fuel, placed inside a wooden structure built from scrap lumber and dry leaves, surrounded by children who had no understanding of fire safety and no adult in the vicinity. The flame inside the lantern threw a warm glow that made the fort feel like a real building. It also threw sparks when bumped, and a tipped lantern could spill burning kerosene across a plywood floor in seconds. Some kids used candles instead, which were only marginally safer in a structure made entirely of combustible material. The combination of an open flame, a flammable structure, and unsupervised children was an accident looking for a place to happen. And yet it happened in every neighborhood, every summer. Number 5. An entire childhood spent breathing secondhand smoke in every room of the house. Cigarette smoke was the background atmosphere of mid-century American life. Parents smoked at the dinner table, in the car with the windows up, in the living room during television, and in the kitchen while cooking. Visitors smoked in your house. You smoked in theirs. The doctor's waiting room had an ashtray. The teacher's lounge smelled like a bar. Family road trips were conducted in a sealed vehicle with one or both parents smoking in the front seat while the children sat in the back breathing it in. The long-term health effects of secondhand smoke on children, including asthma, bronchitis, ear infections, and an increased lifetime risk of lung cancer and heart disease, were not widely acknowledged until the 1980s and 1990s, and behavioral change lagged behind the science by another decade. For an entire generation of American children, cigarette smoke was as constant as the air itself. You breathed it in your house, in your car, in restaurants, in airports, and in every public space you entered. Nobody opened a window for the kids. Nobody stepped outside to smoke. It was just the air. Number 4. Sledding down the steepest hill in town on a trash can lid or a sheet of cardboard. When winter arrived, the steepest hill in the neighborhood became the center of everything. Kids hauled sleds, toboggans, inner tubes, flattened cardboard boxes, and metal trash can lids to the top and launched themselves down slopes that ended in streets, parking lots, drainage ditches, or frozen creeks. There was no groomed sledding run with hay bales at the bottom. There was no adult stationed at the base to stop traffic. You flew down the hill and you figured out how to stop on your own, which usually meant rolling off into the snow at the last moment or crashing into whatever was at the bottom. The metal trash can lid had no handles and no steering. The cardboard lasted 2 runs before it disintegrated. Collisions between sleds were constant. Bloody noses were common, and the occasional broken wrist was treated with the same calm acceptance as any other winter injury. You went back up the hill and did it again. Today, many towns have closed their public sledding hills over liability concerns, and some cities have posted signs banning the activity entirely. Number 3. The unspoken understanding that if you got hurt, you walked it off. The entire medical philosophy of mid-century childhood could be summed up in 4 words: walk it off, kid. A sprained wrist was wrapped in an elastic bandage from the bathroom drawer. A deep cut was cleaned with hydrogen peroxide and held together with a butterfly strip or a piece of tape. Knocked out tooth was rinsed off and put under a pillow. Unless the bone was visibly broken or the bleeding would not stop, you did not go to the doctor. You definitely did not go to the emergency room. The emergency room was for emergencies, and a broken finger or a gash that needed stitches was often not considered one. Children absorbed an astonishing amount of physical punishment from their daily activities and simply moved on. Concussions went undiagnosed because the concept of a mild traumatic brain injury did not exist in any practical sense at the neighborhood level. You got hit in the head, you saw stars, you sat down for a minute, and then you went back to playing. That was the entire protocol. Number 2. The quiet trust that children would figure things out on their own. Behind every item on this list, behind every dangerous game and every unsupervised afternoon and every sharp object placed in a small hand, was a belief that children were fundamentally capable of handling the world around them. Parents in the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s did not assume their children were fragile. They assumed they were resilient. A child who fell down would learn to stand up. A child who burned their hand would learn not to touch the stove. A child who got lost would learn to find their way home. The risks were real, and the consequences were sometimes serious, but the underlying faith was that exposure to the world, even the sharp and dangerous parts of it, was how a person grew up. That faith is almost entirely gone from modern parenting. The world got safer, the supervision got tighter, the lawsuits got bigger, and the assumption shifted from trust to fear. Whether the trade was worth it is a question every generation answers differently. Number 1. The freedom. Not any single toy or any single game, but the whole of it. The open, unsupervised, sometimes reckless, occasionally terrifying freedom of a childhood lived outside, in the weather, with your friends, on your own terms, with no schedule and no structure and no adult standing over your shoulder telling you what was safe. That freedom is the thing that every person who grew up in that era remembers most clearly, and it is the thing that has most completely vanished. You were trusted with your own time. You were trusted with your own body. You were trusted to make mistakes and to learn from the ones that did not kill you. Some of those mistakes hurt, some of them scarred. A few of them were genuine